First and foremost, thank you for inviting me. There are so many people here who know so much more about AI and defense than I do, so this is going to be a fun one. But I do know a little bit about investing. First and foremost, the last time I stood in front of a U.S. flag this close and speaking was actually when I became a U.S. citizen. I had to take oath, and it was really a fun experience. The second is, Colin did a great job of, Dr. Jackson did a great job of, laying out the problems. It was actually so detailed that I almost felt like I should just change everything that I was going to talk about, because I think you laid out the problem really well, and the words you used was this baroque, ecosystem that we have, and we're fighting disruptive warfare. And I think it's going to be the theme of what I'll talk a little bit about. Let me tell you a little bit about Lux Capital and venture capital in general. And then I want to talk a little bit about where we're investing and why defense tech is a space that venture capitalists are investing in. There's a long history of venture capital and defense technology industry working together, but that sort of is, got lost in the shuffle somewhere around 20, 30 years ago and has resurged. And I think it's worth paying attention to. So Lux Capital manages over $4 billion in assets. That's dollars that people have given to us to invest in technology companies. We have invested in about 250 portfolio companies, and this long list that you heard probably from my LinkedIn profile is probably only a fraction of the companies that we've invested in and that I either sit on the boards of or advise. We are investing in and across all stages, from two grad students walking in to build a search engine, proverbially, and to companies that are now at scale, multi-billion-dollar companies expanding globally. We invest in healthcare and life sciences, invest in hardware software problems. We call it deep tech. Deep tech to us is companies that are at the intersection of technology and sciences. Now, the sciences could be biological sciences, physical sciences, computer sciences. So you could be investing in the latest and the greatest drug discovery technologies, antimicrobial stuff, obviously the 2 years that we've all had collectively together. Think about what venture capital money has actually done for all of us while we're together, whether it's Pfizer, BioNTech, or Moderna. Or it could be computer sciences. It's all the work that's happening in cryptography and now being retermed Web3. We invest a lot in machine learning, AI, cybersecurity, hardware software systems that are autonomous and automated, and drones and autonomous cars and LiDARs and simulation systems and so on and so forth. When you think about the AI stack, and I'll try to focus as much as I can on that, because I think it very aptly put earlier that very soon we will stop talking about AI as a field. It's like we don't talk about internet. In 1990s, we used to talk about the internet. This is an internet company. We don't say that anymore. In fact, we don't even call, this is a SaaS company unless you're talking about the economics and the financials. It's like, yeah, everything is available on the web. My email's on the web. So why is everything else not on the web? The same thing will happen to AI. It's going to be an infrastructure layer that gets built into everything we do, right? Construction companies are going to be using AI. Already when you apply for a credit card, AI is being used to assess your qualification for that. I wouldn't be surprised. My kids actually talked about, how can we use AI to do our homework, and that did not go well. But I think, the AI stack, everything from semiconductor technologies onwards to application layer, requires innovation, and that stack is getting built as we speak, right? Not only are we seeing AI-specific chips being made, but in fact, there's innovation happening there so fast that, 5 years ago, we would have said Nvidia is the stock to buy. Nvidia was gaming processor, GPU acceleration, great for AI models, object image recognition type stuff. Today, as AI moves into, AI, ML, and NLP moves towards transformers, there are companies that are basically saying, hey, existing data center infrastructure is not good enough to process transformers, which is, this field within AI, and we need to have new semiconductor technologies to do that. So we've invested across that. Now you take those AI applications running in data centers, take them to the edge. So you could be running an ATAC, you could be, running a motor or a system. Now, how do you process those on site? So we talked about loitering drones earlier. How are you doing image recognition on those drones? Are you sending signals back and forth? Can you be stopped with $50 worth of equipment, jamming that equipment? No, probably you're doing intelligence and observation on board and making decisions on board that vehicle. How do you have that compute capacity available on site requires innovation. We've invested in companies, at least 24 or more companies that directly sell into the DoD or work closely with DoD partners. Some of them expect to become primes. Right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. That's a sore subject for a lot of us in the technology startup industry, even though they can be great partners. But many of them are what we consider dual-use technologies. And dual-use technologies is something we're all still trying to, frankly, understand. Some people in the startup industry will tell you it's a word that was invented by the primes to basically make sure nobody ever makes it to commercial big game. Some others would say that there's real validity to that. The minute you say, and by the way, for those who did not get that joke, the minute you say dual use, somehow it's seen as inferior. It's not ready for prime time. This is like commercial stuff. We have all these things we have to do, the hardening we have to do, and the minute you start doing that hardening, it's no longer dual use. You're basically a defense-specific company. So it's a real quagmire. We want to buy technologies fast, cheap, reliable, quick, innovative, iterating quickly. But the mantra in the decision makers is, hey, this has to be defense grade. Last year, this is a funny thing I was just looking up over there. Last year, US startups raised $329 billion in venture capital. Now, even if this number is off by, 50%, this is a lot of money. This is a lot of money that we are investing. We, as in we, are investing in technology today. Where does venture capital come from? Venture capital money comes from money you've given to your universities to build up their endowments. It is coming from your pension plans. It's coming from teachers' pension plans. It's coming from nonprofit foundations that are running hospitals and running clinics and other institutions. That's where venture capital comes from. And that money is being invested in the technology industry on an annualized basis. So how do we make use of that? What is happening is, and by the way, this number is accelerating. Last year's number was about half that, right? So venture capital has accelerated, and yes, we were in a bubble and all that stuff, but this has been a trend throughout. This has been a real economic engine for our country. There's a funny anecdote here when I talk about venture capital and what we invest in. A friend of mine who's very close to, working with the DoD, once was at a conference, and this gentleman approached him who had worked at a major prime for about 25 years, and he says, you spend $10, $20 billion a year on enterprise technology, software technology. And you run out, what do you do? And he said, well, I go around universities everywhere looking for innovation, meeting people, trying to figure out who can build, what needs to get built, and so on, finding founders. And he says, why can't you just write a requirement doc and give it to a prime and they'll build it for you, right? And to me, it's really funny, but also sad, because it's a mindset, which is to say, hey, if you know what you need to build, just write it up and give it to somebody to build it. But that's not, we know, all of us who are here in Silicon Valley, we know that's not how innovation works, right? We saw an excellent presentation on some of the challenges we have and the threats we face. Can we all sit here in a room, take the next 2 hours, and write out the kind of loitering drone spec that we need to build and just give it to somebody to build? Then job's done. I don't need to have a job, right? Founders don't need to putz around and maybe hope that something works and come up with new ideas. That's not how it works. In fact, in our firm, we have the saying of 100, 0, 100. A lot of people ask us, how do we find the next innovation? And we say 100, 0, 100. At 100% certainty that we will find amazing, incredible technologies that will be game-changing. 0% knowledge of what it is today that I could tell you what I'll be investing in next. Which is why if you look at my portfolio, it ranges from semiconductor technologies to healthcare IT companies to simulation systems for defense technologies to autonomous cars. But I can also tell you the last 100, which is I'm 100% guaranteed that the next innovation that I will find will be at the outer edges of things that I have already invested in, right? Many years ago, about 10 years ago, we got interested in this field of material science called metamaterials, which were used for cloaking devices. Right? So we were thinking about this amazing science, negative refraction index and whatever. What can you do with it? And we worked on it for a couple of years with other people and realized, hey, you can make solid state antennas with it. Cloaking devices would be nice, like Harry Potter and stuff, but a little far from commercialization. But we said, you can use that technology to make steerable antennas that were solid state. Great. So we funded a company, us and Bill Gates funded a company called Chimera. And that's a satellite antenna technology. Talking to them as we were in their boardroom, and they said, hey, there's these two kids who out of NASA and out of Stanford who are working on these satellites that are the size of a shoebox. And we're like, what? And we've all been to SSL, or what used to be SSL, and there's these massive facilities and, $300 million satellite with another $300 to $350 million to put it up in orbit. No, but these are shoebox sites. So we went there, and they were talking to us about a company called Cosmogia, then renamed itself to Planet, that was using these small satellites, which was mostly a lens with some flexible electronics wrapped around it, to say, we're looking for wildebeest in Africa. Now, that same company that we invested in that was looking for wildebeest in Africa and other environmental things is actually being used every day. You can see it on CNN, which is like, hey, here what this plane looked like before the flood arrived, and here's where, Russia is amassing its forces, and you look at the bottom and you will see, image obtained by Planet Labs. These are satellites that cost $100,000, $200,000, and now they have the largest constellation of Earth-observing satellites in space. This company did not exist 6, 7, 8 years ago, right? And then we realized that, hey, there's going to be tons of these satellites sending all this data, so who's going to be doing analysis? Are you going to have armies of people sitting there looking at image that's coming real time? Said, no, it's going to be AI doing that, right? So some automated system is going to be doing that. And then we invested in a company called Orbital Insight, which is a part of Project Maven and other things, but also commercial and defense, to say, hey, all this imagery that's coming together, how do you analyze that imagery in real time to find signals, needle in a haystack sort of an idea, and provide intelligence to your customers? Now, you could be looking at a Walmart parking lot versus a Target parking lot and telling you that, hey, I can tell you Walmart is doing better this quarter than Target. Or you could be looking at, how military forces are moving around in a certain geography. All that is being done automated. So we invested in that company. Now we're talking to that company, and I said, so how does this magic happen? Here's algorithms, but this is a lot of data. And what do you do? And they said, we just run it on GPU clusters. I mean, this is very fast. Like, how do you do this real time? It's very fast. That's where we learned that there's this company called Nvidia that is doing really interesting work in image analytics. And we said, well, it can't be that there's only one company that does that. So we invested in a company, Nirvana, that very quickly, within a year, was bought by Intel to become a part of their image processing engine. And then we looked at, okay, so you're doing that, that's a data center technology, how are we going to do that at the edge? And then we invested in a company called Mythic, which is doing interesting stuff, low power compute for all the same kinds of applications, the drones, the cameras, the edge compute that you're talking about. So the point that I'm making is that I just listed 4 or 5 companies in our portfolio, and there's no way in hell 8 years ago I could have told you when we were looking at metamaterials cloaking devices that we would have invested in semiconductor technologies. But they guide us, one guides us to the other. And that's really, really important as we think about a very diverse set of threats and a very distributed set of threats. How do we design our systems to be resilient while having a learning velocity around that? Now, one other thing about venture capital economics, which I think is just worth mentioning for the reason of the scale that matters. How does venture capital work? LPs, which are, as I mentioned, endowments and pension funds and so on, give money to the investor to invest in companies. The math, the way it works, which a lot of people I'm often surprised don't realize, is if I have $1 billion fund, if I have to stay in business over years, I have to return something like 5x return to my investors. That means I have to give them back $5 billion. That means if in a company that I invest in, I'm a minority investor, maybe I own 15 to 20% of that company, right? So that each company that returns $1 billion to me has to be worth $5 billion or more, right? You do the math and you turn out that for every $1 billion that venture capital tries to invest, they create $30 to $35 billion of economic value, like real market cap of companies that we invest in. That's the only way I can get back $5, $6, $7 billion to give back to my investors. That is scale. But more important than scale, it is not investing in small businesses. Okay? Now, where I'm taking this conversation is to say, this whole idea of small business research, this SBIRs, I've been on a little bit of a rant about this publicly recently, but I want to mention that for two reasons. One, SBIR is about 3% of the 18% of the DoD budget, right? It's a very small amount, and it's very good work that SBIR has to do, push primary research. But SBIR has been seen, unfortunately, as a way for defense industry to acquire technology from startups. And I think the net effect of that over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years has been close to zero. People have written papers on this. Lots of amazing research has happened. I'm sure some of it has been licensed by Raytheons and Lockheeds and Boeings of the world. But you'd be surprised to know that there are businesses, and I call them SBIR mills, that have been funded for decades now to just remain as a research arm, remain within under 500 employees, continue to be a small business, continue to get grants. One of these companies has raised over 1,900 SBIR grants, right? Totaling over $500 million. One company. The top 25, SBIR grant recipients have taken over $5 billion from the SBIR pool of money. And here we are, every time I'm speaking to people, and by the way, this happens all the time, just 2 weeks ago at HBS talking to Undersecretary Heidi Shue, and it keeps coming back. Oh, but we had SBIR, and we're going to reform the SBIR program, and we're going to take phase 2 to, from 2 million to maybe 5 million, and this doesn't work. It's just that dog just don't barking. It's just not going to work. The second thing is, it's really important to understand when there's a bunch of startups in the audience as well. Startups are not small businesses. They may look like small businesses when they're small, but they're not built to remain small. They're genetically architected to scale and grow. And if they don't scale and grow, they die. Right? And that's a fundamental difference. And I think we have to understand that. So when startups are investing in technologies that are cutting-edge AI technologies, what they're trying to do is figure out how do we commercialize that, how do we scale that, how do we do this faster, better, cheaper. And I think that's the value that startups bring to this ecosystem that we need to harness and somehow use for our users. The speed of innovation, I don't think is lost on anybody, has really increased as things become more software. Famous VC once said, software is eating the world, and I think it's really true. That same VC also said it's time to build, and I think that's really true too. It used to be 30, 40 years ago, and there are people in this audience who would understand that better than I do, 30, 40 years ago, the most advanced technologies were built for the military first. They were funded by military, they were used by the military. Then they would go to the enterprise sector when the cost was somewhat reduced, but they were still very expensive, so maybe the IBM would buy it and use it for commercial applications. And eventually, many years later, it would become available for the consumer use. You and I got computers way after DoD and way after commercial enterprises we could afford one. That completely flipped on its head in the last 10, 20 years. The most advanced technologies today are in your pockets. Even your enterprises don't have it, right? Bring your own phone was something that happened because all of us had better phones than what our businesses were giving us. My business gave me a BlackBerry, and I was like, this is a freaking brick compared to this iPhone that I carry in the other pocket. And the business said, okay, you can use a BlackBerry, that's fine. 4-star generals in the government got access to an iPhone 6 years after it was released. So little kids in Palo Alto had better phones than 4-star generals, and probably still remains the case. But this is a real problem, right? Like, we have a real problem in how we think about technology and access to technology. And I'm sure, the presentation earlier showed parts of that. Like, we're building technology now that the Iranians and the Turks and others are copying. Why? Because this is technology that we built like 10 years ago. They've had copies of it built over the last 10 years. How do we bring technology to our warfighter that is being developed now in real time? Because that's our cutting edge, that's our competitive advantage. We don't have process to doing that. Part of the reason has been that we had this centralized approach to innovation. as a part of the Second World War effort and so on, we said here all these effectively utilities, right? If you think of primes as a few utilities, and we said, you do the work for us, we're going to cap your profits. They were all done with all the right intentions, and they've done amazing work over decades, but you're going to be our, technology development engine. Now, if you look at the top, if Trey from Founders Fund was here, he always uses statistics on that. If you look at the top graduates coming out of all top computer science schools in this country, you will find hardly any have gone on to go work at a prime. Part of the reason is that the economy has been great. They're all working at Google and Uber and DoorDash, and there's just great money, great technical challenges. They don't want to go work for a prime. I wish that was different, but that's not the case. What that means is that in that talent war, we are not finding the best talent to work on problems that are defense-related. And those problems are becoming increasingly so computer science, machine learning, AI-oriented problems. So we don't have the best minds in this country, which we are amazing at, right? We have a process by which we go around the world, not just around the country, around the world, we find the best talent, bring them here, use taxpayer money like you guys did on me, educate people like me, train us, and then we don't use them for the defense industry and national security. Either we let them just leave the country, which then they become a threat because they go work for our adversaries, or we don't have a process by which we utilize them for national security because they work in commercial enterprises, and that bridge does not exist. Our competitors' adversaries don't have that problem. In fact, all of us know that if you're in China, you can be any business, you're by law required to comply with the Chinese government national security interests. There's no way out. There's no saying, oh, I don't want to work for this, I'm not really sure if we're going to have collateral damage, I don't want to work in any technology. That just doesn't exist. Right? And that's a real problem. Like, how do we solve that problem of having the best talent work for us? We're living through some pretty precarious times. There are very smart people here who know a lot more about this, economics, socio-politically, and so on. Let me read you an excerpt from a recent annual letter from a venture capitalist that if I named him, most of us would know. If it wasn't obvious by the end of 2020, it became clear at the end of 2021 that a number of global actors has seized the opportunity to challenge the US's political and economic leadership. Even countries that we have long counted as steadfast allies have started to hedge their bets. Saudi Arabia. These global actors have already begun forming their own alliances, and increasingly the concept of our enemy's enemy is our friend is their modus operandi. We're seeing trade agreements, defense agreements, lending programs, and all manner of strategic and financial cooperation from countries that were previously thought of as strange bedfellows. Russia and China, China and Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia and China, Israel and China, Russia and India. This is all familiar to us. So why is this happening? In some ways, this is the latest attempt to undermine US's role as the ultimate mediator and arbitrator of conflict, and the US dollar's standing as the reserve currency of the world. At various points in the past, usually during similar moments of volatility, we've always been able to rely on the US government as the iron fist and the US dollar as the velvet glove that could drive resolution of world issues. That is no longer the case. That is the reality. That's the reality today, and I see this as a venture capitalist. I'm not a political economist. I'm certainly not an academic, even though I have a PhD. I deal with entrepreneurs and founders who are looking for incredible technologies that they can build incredible companies around. They see this, and they ask questions. Should their companies be headquartered here? We know of semiconductor companies that came out of the US but headquartered themselves in the UK because they felt like they could then sell globally better. We know of this entire movement on cryptocurrencies and so on. Part of that is happening. Yeah, sure, you think it's happening because of tax purposes. They're all in Miami or Bahamas or wherever, hell, Puerto Rico or whatever. No, it's more than that. There's an entire underlying current to say, why US dollar to begin with? Why should we be trading in US dollars? Now that, yeah, sure, we can have an philosophical debate about that, but that has real consequences for US national security. And I think that is what we have to work on. Like when we talk about US needs to have regulations in place that allow cryptocurrencies to thrive and manage, it's not only because I want to own Dogecoin or whatever else, right? That's not the only place it's coming from. It's also coming from, if we don't do this, it will happen, and it will happen outside the US. And that's a real threat to us. So then he goes on to say, so how do we fix this decay? Well, I'm generally of the opinion that in moments when the cards are not in our favor, it is critical to speak softly and carry a big stick. Specifically, this means our domestic house in order, getting our domestic house in order, to return a balance sheet to health, to invest in critical infrastructure that renders us allies with, but not dependent on any other country, and to strengthen the next generation of our military, which is less about big iron tanks and aircraft carriers and more about non-obvious weapons like hackers, satellites, and drones. This is precisely where venture capital is investing in defense tech. We've had two mega success stories in defense venture investments, SpaceX and Palantir, but they're not the only ones. This happens to be in space and happens to be in AI and data. But if you look at the next generation of startups that are coming up, some of them have raised over, one of our portfolio companies, Anduril, just one company alone has raised over $1 billion, right? And so billions of dollars have flown into a few companies, Shield and Rebellion and so on. There's quite a few companies. They're all working in these spaces. Right? We have companies that we started off with, as I mentioned, looking for solid-state antennas for satellite communications. Then we went to making small satellites for Earth observation. Then we went to Earth observation platforms for AI. Then we invested in manufacturing in space. Then we invested in rockets that can take manufacturing to space, like literally doing it in space. Then we invested in, hey, how do we manufacture for space? Additive manufacturing and all that. This is all in space, and this is just one venture capital firm that probably many of you had never even heard of before you came into this room. Right? This is happening. How do we accelerate that, and what are the risks that we face to do that better? So why are we investing in AI and these related technologies? Well, there was an article that I think came out in 2020 that used the term hyperwar. I don't know if it's commonly used now, but certainly hyperwar is combat that would be waged under the influence of AI, where human decision-making is going to be almost entirely absent. Okay? And this is where I think that comment, Dr. Jackson made earlier, Baroque arsenal meets disruptive innovation becomes very important. Because that is war that's being brought to our doorsteps. We have to fight that war. It's not our choice. It is the war that's happening. Some of you ask questions about Ukraine. This is the first time we're seeing actually relatively commercial technology play an important role in a war directly. That we're trying to do a lot of things without having direct fingerprints on it. And commercial satellites are collecting data and annotating them, and war targets are being handed back to the Ukrainians. There was this discussion a few years ago, there was noise that Silicon Valley does not care for defense tech, does not care for military, does not care for nationalism and patriotism and so on. That discussion, in my opinion, has died out. It was never true. Yes, there's pockets, but there's always pockets. There's always been pockets. I wasn't around, but I'm sure 60s and 70s weren't just like, oh yeah, let's go America time. There were people who protested against working for the defense establishment and defense industry. That's always been the case, but that's not the case by and large. And we're talking about Silicon Valley. I'm not talking about America in general. Silicon Valley founders have a sense of mission. Silicon Valley founders do not just work for money. You think Mark Zuckerberg goes to job every day because he wants to make more money? You think Elon Musk does the crazy things that he does because he wants more money? What for? It's bigger headache to find people to manage that money because he can't spend that money, right? These people are mission-driven. You and I may not agree with their mission, but founders are mission-driven. Every single VC will tell you, we invest in mission-driven founders. We understand what makes us special. Sure, some people like me who've been given a chance to be a part of this country and get a citizenship here may appreciate it more, because we know what it can be when you don't have that, when you don't have the freedoms that the US gives. But certainly, I think almost every American I can speak for, even those that I vehemently disagree with, understand the sense of mission of what it means to be able to protect our freedoms. And Silicon Valley founders are no different. They get that sense of mission, and to be honest, they're also practical. We talked about $750 billion defense budget. That's not chump change. We may not know how to access it as startups, but that's a lot of money. And that's a lot of money on an annualized basis. It may go down to 700, 650, may go up to 900 billion or trillion, who knows? But it's a lot of money. And it's in every sector, right? National security problems are not limited. Entrepreneurs today, if you talk to the best entrepreneurs, and I'm sure many of you meet these guys regularly, right? What do they want to work on? They don't want to work on clicking engine on some search search engine. That's not what they want to work on. They may end up working on it for a short while as they build their careers. But what they want to work on is autonomous cars. They want to work on rockets. They want to go to Mars. They want ships that sail autonomously and you're not risking human lives when in the Indo-Pacific Ocean. Virtual border walls, brain-computer interfaces. These crazy mavericks that I call them are really imagining what science fiction should be if it became science fact and actually making it happen. That is, this is all people that are in the US that are highly trained, that are working on these problems. We just have to figure out how to harness that and utilize their technologies. We have to find ways to get their technologies into the hands of our warfighters. That is a big, big challenge. I think the new, now I've said all these things, how difficult it is and whatnot. By the way, there's a lot of interesting things happening too. Like defense industry is not just sleeping. There are champions within the defense industry. There are pockets of people who have small amounts of budget, who can actually accelerate businesses, and they understand, that adoption of new technologies is extremely important. And those people are actually going out of their way to figure out how to partner with Silicon Valley. They're not coming to Silicon Valley, shake hands, kiss babies, do photo op, and leave. They're actually spending time at venture firms. For groups like Silicon Valley Defense Group and others are actually helping promote that. But they're spending time to really understand where the gaps are. What I mean by that is, why is it that Silicon Valley doesn't understand defense and defense industry doesn't understand Silicon Valley? And it's understandable. Most people in Silicon Valley started working on coding and whatever they were doing at the age of like 13. Last Monday, we invested in a business plan that was written by a 15-year-old. Right? These guys are becoming younger and younger. At 15, I didn't even know anything. Right? I didn't even know what chemistry was, let alone realize that I'm going to do a PhD in chemistry. But these people, they haven't worked in the defense sector. Right? They haven't been to DC, let alone worked in DC. They don't understand how military functions and what all military does. Many of them are surprised when they hear a huge portion of our military budget just goes to VA. Right? So it's understandable that they have no idea when we talk about acquisitions and here's a customer and they really want your technology, but then they may be a 4-star general, but they have $0 to buy anything. You have to talk to this other guy who has all the money, and this person has no understanding even of what this guy really wants. And then there's a 15-year process to get a program of record. So good luck. Oh, you can start with a $50,000 SBIR grant, and they're like, wait a second, what? Right? I can see how founders and entrepreneurs in technology sector are like, I really don't understand this customer. I just don't get this sector. And then defense industry is the same way, where there's technology has been seen for a long time as a caricature of itself, which is like, pizza eating, beer drinking, coding at night, and creating dating websites. Right? That's not true anymore. The technologies that we're building are incredibly powerful. Right? Like, have you gone on to Facebook lately and posted a photo? It will automatically tell you that's you. It will automatically point out all the people that are friends that you can just auto-tag them. That's facial recognition technology, probably as good or better than what Chinese might be deploying. The question is, it's not being used. It's been dialed down. It's been derated because people are scared that, hey, if I do it full-fledged, then the defense industry might come calling and I may not want to talk to them. That, I think, is, there's a chasm that we have to bridge. And if we're able to do that, not only that this technology will become available and the needs and the capability requirements of the military will be more obvious, but also importantly, I think it starts a virtuous cycle where serendipity will also start to take effect. New ideas will come out of it, whether it's in quantum computing or whether it's cryptography or whether it's in AI or whether it's in hardware software systems. New ideas will come out because you're thinking about problems that could be coming down the road. And I think we need those minds to be working for us. There is a talent war out there. Every company, every CEO will tell you that there's a talent war out there. And if major CEOs of companies like Apple and Google are having a hard time finding the right talent, startups that are able to give not only competitive salaries, but a lot of equity in these companies, you can imagine that it is harder for companies where you don't have any equity and you're working for relatively lower paid jobs compared to Silicon Valley jobs. It's going to be hard to acquire talent. Again, that is another impetus for why we should be partnering with these guys. So all this said, look, we are at war. We have to accept it. All of us who are investing in defense technology industry as startups or growth companies or whatever have understood that. Some people have asked, is, Ukraine conflict really, worth us going to war with Russia? And my answer to them is, we've been at war with Russia. I don't know when have we not been at war with Russia, right? Or they say, if you do this, you might spark a conflict. If you take TSMC factories and force them to set up a factory here in the US, you will strike a conflict with China. We are at a conflict with China. We have space wars going on now. We have hyper missiles that are being developed right now that could be used against us from space. Right? We are at war, and there's just no other way but to say we have to accept it. And I think as we're seeing in Ukraine, increasingly so, not only is it going to be a decentralized war, but it's actually going to be what, as I mentioned earlier, hyper war. There's going to be a tremendous use of software technology, and we have to be investing in that. As we go through these motions, and this is a conversation that happens when we have our portfolio CEOs together and we talk about this stuff, we talk about foreign adversaries like China and all kinds of issues like, do you hire Chinese American? Is that considered Chinese? Right? I'm a Pakistani American. Should we hire a Pakistani American if we were at war with Pakistan? Now, as a board member at some of these companies, I've had calls where CEOs and said, hey, this customer called and they asked, do you have people of Chinese origin? And I asked them, do you mean Chinese or Chinese Americans? And they said, I'll let you decide that. Now, that question mark is a really important one. What do we stand for? What is our policy in this regard? So as we think about these kinds of conversations, there's three things that I always try to think about, why we are special and we will remain special, and I remain hopeful. One is learning velocity. We learn fast. I always say to my CEOs that all of you probably think startups win because they have the best technology, they're better than everybody else in technology. I think startups don't win because they have the best technology. Startups win because they have speed. There's not anything that we can invent that very quickly somebody else cannot either copy or become at least 80% as good as. Right? You may have some time advantage, but you have speed. And speed in a particular direction becomes velocity, and I think we have that, which, by the way, our adversaries don't. Second is opportunistic mindset. There's a famous book called Thinking in Bets. We learn quickly, and we think opportunistically. We don't have 5-year, 10-year, 15-year plans, and trust me, I've heard enough on why we need to have those, and I'm sure there's utility to those. Certainly our adversaries have found great utility in that. But serendipity of invention and innovation is also something extremely important. We have to just figure out how do we learn from that. When we talk about in software industry iteration cycles, it's not a guy sitting in a room and coming up with an idea, then going to the other side of the room and saying, let me come up with a different idea. That's not how it works. You take a technology, you take a product, you put it out into the market, we call it the MVP, you put it out there, you see the reactions, and you quickly iterate on the basis of customer feedback. And you say, okay, how do I make it better? Customer didn't like that. I thought this was great, but the customer didn't even understand how to use this. I need to change the UI. Or, hey, the customer is deploying it on these platforms and there's conflict, so let me change this architecture. That's what happens. That's what iteration is. We all heard about it. The problem with the defense tech industry and Silicon Valley working together, we can't have iteration cycles because we can't get technology in the hands of the end users. We get stuck in the R&D world, right? So a bunch of researchers continuing to work on it. We need to be finding ways to get products into the hands of the warfighter. And the last bit, and this is personal and important to me, which is, we are a democracy. And one of the things that's really special about democracies is that they are able to not only retain but they are also able to attract allies. People want to work with people like us. I had this conversation recently with a group of friends in technology, and it was really interesting. And it was a learning exercise. It's not like I had a point of view on it. I said, China is very influential. China is buying ports around the world and building highways around the world and has a really dedicated program towards increasing its influence that way. And the question I asked was, what countries in the world do you see that want to adopt Chinese culture? And culture with the small c, so I'm not talking about Chinese music and dancing and stuff only, but basically, who has said that this is how we should create our economies? And we were hard-pressed to find another country. And the list of enemies of the US is actually fairly long right now, from Russia to China to Iran, and the list can continue. That, I think, is something that we have to really preserve and promote. We have an enormous opportunity right now, especially starting with technology. Technology industry pervasive around the world and entering every part of our economy. I call it that part of my job is to digitize vast swaths of the GDP that haven't adopted technology. The last 25 years of technology for most of the world has been manifested in two ways. One, commerce. We can buy stuff online. Two, communication. We can email, we can read our newspapers online, and so on, right? But almost everything else has been the same. Try buying a car. You will probably end up buying the car the same way grandfather did 30 years ago. We'll still have to show up. The guy will still come and say, let me talk to my manager and come back, right? Still the same way. You're like, what manager? Is there anybody in that room you're talking to? But the point is, cars are manufactured the same way. And I think that is the opportunity. So vast swaths of our GDP are digitizing as we speak. And it's not just our GDP. GDP around the world is digitizing. We have to be not only providers of technology, but actually make noise about it that this is our doing. We are providing this to you. That is goodwill that nobody else is capable of earning. That is the goodwill, frankly, if you go, Pakistan, where I originally come from, and other parts of the world, you see, that's what China is doing. We're building this highway for you, we're giving these buses to you, and that has huge implications. I think we have an opportunity to really play a leadership role there. Okay, I'll stop here, and I don't know if you have any time for questions, but I'm open to questions if there are any.
From a VC perspective, what does a successful exit look like from a dual-use or defense tech startup?
So the question was, from a VC perspective, what does a successful exit look like from a dual-use startup? Ideally, dual-use works in such a way that we don't have to call it dual-use anymore. Defense industry is just a series of customers. SOCOM is a customer, Army is a customer, Navy is a customer, Rapid Equipping Force is a customer, so on and so forth. What you really want is not a company, we can look at example. We do not want a company that is a utility where you will make revenues and will give you 10% margin on it. That is not a scalable company because you don't get enough cash flow to invest back into the business. Right? You're not investing in R&D on your own. What you're doing is you're waiting for the government says, we need, small drones. A startup would say, hey, 40 days later, we have an anti-drone company ready for you. Our company, Anduril, did that. 40 days later, they showed up with a bunch of tools and said, we put our technology, our minds. You said you wanted anti-drone technologies. We have it. Right? What would a prime do? A prime would say, yeah, that's a very good idea, sir. Let me write a requirements doc that comes up with a 5-year plan. It will take $230 million. If you fund it, we will hire 2,000 people in 17 states who will work on this drone technology, and then we'll have a very capable small UAS system for you. Because they don't have any money to invest in it. That's just not how they work. That is the difference. Right? If for Anduril, just using that as an example, as one of the more successful startups in the recent times, they have a few $100 million in revenue. That few $100 million of revenue has attracted billions of dollars of venture capital to them. That is the leverage that defense industry should get, right? And that few $100 million is not just US customer base, right? Some of our allies, NATO allies, and so on are part of the customer base too. So for short customer dollars, That's been very successful. And I think that is the primary ask from a dual use perspective, become a customer. I do not want your grant dollars. I do not want your technical validation. I don't want to hear from you that you are now TRL 7 and not 6. Irrelevant to me. I do my own work. I do my own diligence. If I have a product you can buy that product. If somebody else has a product and a capability that can give it to you better, buy their product. I am every day, any day ready to compete on that basis. What I'm not willing to do and not capable of doing, frankly, is, hiring 17 four-star generals on my board, working for 8 years to come up with a multi-billion-dollar proposal over a 10-year period so that you can have access to that technology 10 years from now. My company will be long gone by then.
So I've spoken to about a dozen venture-backed startups on asking why don't you sell to DoD? And a lot of them say that their VCs tell them, don't even bother, right? They cite reasons like the data is not commercially, to the commercial standard. They say there's too many requirements that are specific to DoD. There's not a clear revenue stream coming back. What, in your perspective, are the top 2 or 3 things stopping startups who are venture-backed from selling to DoD?
So it's a great question. And by the way, there's few VCs who do this. I mean, there's, many of them are here or speaking here. Meaning many of the VCs invest in defense technology companies. Most VCs would back off. Number one reason, generalizable, would be sales cycle. Sales cycle is just way too long. We talk about that for every kind of a customer. If you're in the automotive industry, you go try to sell to Kia, not to Toyota, right? Because Kia is going to move fast. They want better technology faster. I can tell you, all my friends are buying Kias now. They look cooler. The new models look cooler. They have the most amount of technology available to you. They may not last as long, but that's only a matter of time. They'll become better. But Kias, I don't know if you guys have noticed, there are more Kias selling than ever before. If you want to sell technology, that's the customer you talk to because they'll move faster. And in defense industry, if you are not an expert at selling, you're in a 15-year time horizon. If you're an expert in selling and you understand the difference between an SBIR and an OTA and STTR, and you know who the people are, and you know who the program officers are, and you know who has a pot of money that has an urgent need that they need, and so on and so forth. If you have that capability, you might be able to get some small monies and some small customer engagements, and then maybe a small program in 5 years, 3 years, maybe max, right? Earliest. So now think about the investment that goes into it. A startup can burn anything from $300,000 to $3 million a month. Right? So when a year of delay could be $6 million, could be $12 million for a company waiting for maybe this customer will come back. That is a real problem because companies run out of money. We all know startups raise money on 12, 18, 24-month cycles. So if in that 12, 18, 24-month cycle, if you haven't shown a real traction with that customer that, we've got POs and we're accelerating and growing and our TAM is growing and so on, you're like, this is not working. Why should I invest in you further? Right? So that's the number one problem. The second problem is, again, I don't want to, I'm not an anti-prime guy, but, primes have trained the audience to look for, there's significant lobbying. Right? Now, startups don't hire lobbying firms. Google does, Microsoft does, but startups don't do that. So how do you work around that? Right? Startups they have an office in Silicon Valley. They have 2 guys who are in Miami. Well, you have to have a team in Louisiana before we can fund this. What? Mr. Chang, please move to Louisiana? How does that work? Right? And by the way, there's no customer contract yet, so maybe it'll work. Oh, you have in Louisiana, but if you were in, Alabama as well, we can get another senator to sign on to this. So that'd be great. Now, we can't do that. The lengthy requirements, the audit requirements are incredible. Trying to get onto the FedRAMP process, good luck. Right? There are companies that are getting funded by VCs to somehow circumvent the FedRAMP process and say, is there a better way, faster way for startups to become eligible to get government contracts? So, again, they're institutional barriers. Startups are actually, as always, are trying to find ways around it. But for a lot of people, this is just not the juice is not worth the squeeze for a lot of people, especially in times where, enterprises are growing, enterprises are buying, consumers are buying. Databricks is a massive company. I asked one of their founders, and I said, military was an early customer of yours, like a $30-50 billion business. Defense industry was an early customer. If you were to go back in time, would you do the same thing again? And he said, hell no. We almost died. I would absolutely go to the commercial sector first, and then when I become big, maybe. So here's the problem. We have startups who want to work with defense industry because they don't have any other sources of financing, so even a $50,000 grant or a $1 million grant is massive amount of money to them, so they will apply to all the SBIR grants and stuff. And then you have these large organizations, Google and Microsoft and others. They want to work with the DoD because they're thinking of expanding their TAM. Google Cloud is very large in the commercial sector, but almost non-existent in the defense sector. That's a massive push for them to get into the DoD business. But it's everything in the middle that's basically not really interested in the defense sector. And that's where real innovation is. Innovation that can actually be used by the customer. So it's not R&D and very startup-y stuff, but it's also not Google-type stuff, right? It's this massive middle, that is where we need to spend money and buy their products. And, all the people who talk all the time about acquisitions are working hard on figuring out ways to get capital allocated to that.
So, John Fisher, so about 6 years ago, or so, the Air Force recognized the need to be in Silicon Valley, right? It's closer, faster, more better. And they set up their SBI, our office here. I just checked the site, and there's probably 10 or 15 items out there that are available. And this is all well and good, closer collaboration, Moffett Field, right here in the heart. But I think, really, isn't the elephant in the room the fact that the presidential budgeting cycle is 7 years? I mean, that really bootstraps it, and we have to do that because, that's what Congress says we have to do in order to procure weapon systems. What are your thoughts on that? Has there been any kind of innovation on the startup side to perhaps address that or get around it? We all know, right, NAVAIR, home of Navy Marine Corps aircraft, we still have 2 refueling drogue systems, one the Marines use and one the Navy uses. So if you have a joint strike fighter, which is not very joint, by the way, we still have to, who are we going to refuel today? Plug and play this. I was there at a time when somebody said, hey, if you take this adapter, we can refuel everybody's airplanes. What are your thoughts on the budget cycle and how we could strategize on that?
So you're 100% right. This is a big problem. And it's not just defense, it's the worst in defense. But if you think about the automotive industry the same way, if you want to get onto a vehicle, it's used to be a 5-year development cycle. And for many startups, that's like, okay, so I have a customer now, but they will only give me the first dollar of real revenue 5 years from now. And, it was all these design win ideas and so on and so forth. So it exists in other industries too. DoD is worse primarily because it's also very opaque. So it's not even a competitive process that is, you can't call up somebody and say, hey, where are we in the competitive process? Who's competing in this process? What is the process? Unclear. The second part of it is that the way, and again, all of this I'm sure was done for right reasoning, is the responsibilities have been divided up between different groups. So if you're talking to the end customer, who is telling you what their capability requirements are, which are going to be very different than the R&D team that may have the SBIR budget to give you, which is very different than the acquisition person who's like, yeah, I know that's all fine, but you don't meet the criteria, so you can't get the contract. And then there's a budgeting cycle on top of it. So layers of complexity are really bad. The presence of all of these agencies here, by and large, and not just the AFWorks program and so on, but DIU and others that have set up offices here. The good thing is, number one, there's somebody to talk to. I mean, and through them, other people to talk to. So at least the founders are able to have a more direct conversation, even if it's temporary, with end users and customers. Like, what is the requirement? What is needed? Like, what do you need in the field? You have to, if one of my partners went and spent a week with Special Operations Forces in Pacific Theater, and you realize that we're talking about AI and stuff, and these guys are still using duct tape to kind of literally physically duct tape to get their operations done, right? And you start to understand, oh my God, your needs are vast. So that's really helpful. The problem is that, as I said earlier, we have turned this SBIR and stuff, people get upset at me when I say that, this has become like an entitlement program. Okay? And that is unfortunate because in current political climate, nobody wants to touch that. We have all these hundreds and thousands of companies, all these employees in all these states. We create jobs, we create innovation. It's innovation theater. And there are lots of people who have vested interests other than, advancing the availability of technology to a warfighter in a combat zone that want to keep it that way. We have to eventually, in my opinion, find another way to acquire technologies. We have to find, probably there's a reason and method and why we have presidential budget cycles that are long and so on, and maybe that's needed for some types of things and to prevent the big corruption, so to say, or misuse of the system. But if we are going to be acquiring technology that is iterating and developing really fast, we currently do not have the mechanism to do that. It's a little bit like, I was at a conference at InQtel, my phone got hacked. That afternoon, I went to an Apple store, bought a new phone, I'm ready to go. Company said, yeah, here's whatever, $1,000, $1,200, get a new phone. I'm ready to go because I'm operational. I have the latest, greatest technology in my pocket. Imagine if our computer buying cycles were on the same cadence as our home buying cycle. Every time we buy a new home, you all get new computers. It just doesn't work. And that's what we have right now, right? Like you try to sell a AI-based drone detection system, anti-drone system, and you're basically roughly on the same cycle as somebody who's going after a, autonomous submarine system. And that's going back to that question, for a lot of startups, it doesn't work. We have to come up with a new mechanism for doing that. There are people who've been pushing for it. Hey, can we adopt OTAs to do that? There's lobbying who's against that, and that hasn't happened. What other mechanisms are out there that we can find? Do we give more authority for acquisition directly to the COCOMs? That's been raised. Some people will say COCOMs don't know how to acquire damn things, so that doesn't work. So I don't know what the end state needs to look like, but current mechanisms of acquiring fast, rapidly moving technology simply do not exist.
Hi, my name is Aarti, and head of products in Primer.ai. We use AI and NLP to look at threat monitoring or have infrastructure during war to look at audio and health. Some of the things which you expressed are very much in our wheelhouse in terms of PORs and SBIRs. And I am very passionate about getting my technology to help more Americans and troops, and it's just not going as fast as we'd love to do. One thing you talked about, a lot of changes on the DoD side or on the government side. When you think about VCs, do you think differently about returns and growth rates, or even in a board meeting with a company which does dual use? Is it a different kind of expectation that you have, knowing that this situation is not going to turn immediately? What is the VC industry as a whole doing so that we all don't face the pressure that Elon Musk kind of faced when he had a few $100,000 before he got the $1.4 billion deal? Yes, one is we can't sell, as you know, as fast as in the commercial, and so how can we all help is a question.
Yeah, so great question, and reminds me of a program that Silicon Valley Defense Group, SVDG, is running on taking select companies, because they can only do it with so many companies at a time, but helping them figure out how to hack the system. And I don't mean in a bad way, but like hack the system of acquisitions. Right? Amazing technology companies simply do not know how to sell to the DoD. Even for that champions that I talked about, that there are champions, there are pockets of money available that you can access, but most people don't. Most people who are scientists developing advanced technologies are not experts in going around acquisition processes. So there is a need, and right now, because it's seen as a black art, everybody kind of keeps it to themselves, but there's a need for a greater transparency into how to maneuver around the bureaucracy to actually deliver results and actually get sales. This is something that VCs are working on right now. Like, I mean, I know a lot of these, I mean, part of the reason why I speak at conferences like this and bore you guys is to meet with other people and understand, you know, what are the best practices that we can share across. If you're an enterprise software company, so let's assume you're a brilliant computer science researcher, PhD from Stanford, came up with some new technology, you're trying to commercialize that, you can go hire great VPs of engineering, you can hire great VPs of product, you can hire VPs of sales and marketing, and they'll tell you, hey, if you're selling to, you know, this sector is going to require inside sales or channel sales, and here's the channel partners I can develop, here's the distribution partners. They will know all of this, and you can hire those guys to bring that expertise in to build up your sales team. In the defense sector, that does not exist. Right? Like, you're a startup, who you're going to hire? I have CEOs that I have funded who come to me and say, so we've been thinking about entering the defense sector. What should we do? Here are the options. Number one, should we first hire a 4-star general on our board? Okay, well, maybe we should hire a head of sales, but then a defense federal head of sales. Should we put them in DC or Silicon Valley? Oh, should we hire a lobbying firm? Should the lobbying firm be focused on the White House or legislative branches, maybe local governments, right? These are the questions that they have. Should we hire a different person for sales and a different person for BD in the government, somebody who's walking the halls of Pentagon and somebody who's like, hey, is there money here or not? Move on. And these are questions that, number one, most startups cannot hire like 5, 10 people to do this. You know, and I think this is where, you know, Silicon Valley can come together and frankly teach each other. And my hope is that if these companies that have been invested in over the last few years become successful, the Andurils and the Rebellions and the Shields and the Sail Drones and the Nozomis of the world, if they become successful, you will have alumni from them who will go on and then join these companies, and they'll say, aha, I know how to sell cybersecurity software to DoD. Oh, I know how to sell space technologies to the DoD. And I think that hasn't happened yet. It's, you know, Anduril guys are, by the way, ex-Palantir guys, right? Like, so they basically said, let's learn what we learned from Palantir, what mistakes we made, don't make those mistakes, but things that we did right, go do those. And that one of those lessons was fooling around with the SBIR money is nonsense. And to be honest, the second lesson for them was also this dual-use stuff is nonsense. Now, that's their take, and I'm a portfolio company, but I have 19 other companies that sell dual-use. But their take was that if you're going to build, and if you're going to go after the $100 million or $1 billion contracts, eventually DoD, we're not where DoD will accept dual-use. They will eventually say, yeah, it needs to be customized to our uses, and soon you're not dual-use anymore.
Can you comment on, you've given several examples as to where the problems are in the relationship between the DoD and the startups, but are there examples where it is positive, and in particular I'm thinking of other countries. So for instance in Israel there seems to be a much closer relationship between startups and their Department of Defense. What works there, or is that misinterpretation? Could you comment on that, please?
No, Israel is a great place for technology innovation, and they've done an amazing job of having defense industry support true innovation in all sectors that then come out. But Israel is a small market, so by design, you're like immediately go internationally and especially to the US. So it's a great place to see innovation and early stage innovation. But we're starting to see some, you know, success stories elsewhere too. So for example, wherever decision making is simpler and in the hands of a few people, it goes faster. Right? Like, and it applies to companies and it applies to governments. So if you're selling to NSA, long bureaucratic process. If you're selling the same MI6, you know, smaller budgets, but a single person who can decide whether I want to buy this technology or not. We have a, you know, Anduril just got a big contract in Australia. And they're, you know, so this is for their DIVE product, which is a subsurface autonomous vehicle. And Australia was like, hey, we don't want to work with a prime and give them a whole bunch of money over a 10-year period. How can we do cost sharing to see that this technology, does it work for what we have to do? And if it does, then we have a massive contract for you. And Anduril was perfectly for that and said, hey, there we go. We are available for that. Similarly, Saildrone has been doing work in Bahrain and in Gulf of Aqaba, and same thing where you have Israel, you have Jordan, you have U.S., the Fifth Fleet, and they're all working together, and they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we pool some money together, and how do we get some resources allocated? And in all of these cases, it's not as much, of course technology plays a role. You want something that works and has the capability of doing what it needs to do. But most important thing is having that capacity in-house, that resource, human resource and knowledge base in-house, and the tenacity to work around and figure out how to find pockets of money to do that. And that's effectively business development and sales. And that has, traditional business development and sales for DoD has been done the primes way, long multi-year processes, lots of whining and dining, and sort of hanging out, and the revolving doors of government people working for them and then going back and all that stuff. Startups are trying to change the game. They're basically saying, we are going to invest in technology development and product development. You should buy products. You should not be funding our research. You should not be funding our development. You should be buying our products. And I think VCs like that better because we have risk capital to invest, right? I'm fine if 8 or 9 of my companies don't work as long as one of them works, right? I am willing to, as an investor, take deeply technical risk as long as the market is there, right? We are investing in cancer drugs because we know that if we invent it, there's a market there, right? What does not work is if you take deeply technical risk, but you don't know that if you get there to the other point and have a product, is there a market there on the other side? Is there a customer there with money on the other side? That, I think, is what VCs are trying to work around and basically say, how do we identify that better? How do we get product market fit? Simple things that we hear about. What is a product market fit? An SBIR grant is not a product market fit, right? So if we can figure that out, you will see a lot more money going. I mean, these are long-term secular industries. They continue to grow. Our defense threats are not going away. Our technology needs are not going away. This is an amazing market for founders to be building companies in. The problem has just been that it's a completely opaque process and people don't know how to sell. That's what we have to solve. Sorry, I'll be available here for more questions people have.